Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Mega Projects. This one is the James Bay Project, which, just because of the way it's called, makes me think of James Cameron and Michael Bay making some epic project together, but that's not at all what it's about. It's completely different, and let's get into it. Covering a huge portion of Canada's Quebec province, equal in size to that of the entire state of New York, this is North America's Three Gorges Dam. The James Bay Project is simply vast in size, and yet is probably a mega project that few really know much about. Composed of 8 separate hydroelectric generating stations, numerous dams and reservoirs, which spread over an area measuring roughly 350,000 square kilometers, this was one of the world's largest energy projects and cost upwards of $20 billion to complete. The project officially got underway in 1971, and I can tell you right now that it was a rocky ride until it was finally halted in 1994. Environmental and social concerns, lawsuits, riots, inter-union battles, and a dash of the Canadian mafia, well, this story has it all. James Bay sits at the southern edge of its mammoth brother, the Hudson Bay. If you look at the map, James Bay looks a bit like a strange small growth hanging off the bottom of the Hudson. To the west of the bay lies Ontario, and to the east, Quebec, where the focus of our video falls. To call this area remote would be underselling it. From the Le Grand One power station, part of the James Bay project, Montreal by car is an arse-numbing 1,380 kilometers, which should take you in the region of 17 hours, and that's assuming that the weather is okay. This part of Canada experiences the kind of winters that few of us ever encounter. Its record low was a frosty -44 Celsius, which is -48 Fahrenheit, and even its average low in February is -27.3, that's -17 Fahrenheit. An area of pristine beauty that is often compared to Siberia, with similar tundra and forests of black spruce trees, this area is home to a wide range of animals, including lynxes, black bears, foxes, as well as the largest concentration of caribou anywhere on the planet. On the human side, the area has been home to the native Cree and Inuit people for many centuries, and as we'll get into later in the video, the fusing of this supposed progress and the indigenous people who called the area home has not exactly been easy. The vast swath of land includes hundreds of rivers that drain into James Bay, many of which are relatively small, but some of which are powerful rivers good enough to build a dam on. People began eyeing the hydroelectric potential of these rivers back in the 1950s. Water surveys were carried out on the Nottoway, Broadback, and Rupert rivers by a team working for the Shawinigan Water and Power Company to gauge the possibility of diverting these rivers, which they believed would boost the output of their existing power stations. Things changed in 1963 with the nationalization of the privately owned utility companies, and preliminary findings from the survey were now passed on to Hydro-Quebec, who initially chose to pass on any development, choosing instead to focus on projects on the North Shore. However, by 1965, the company's eyes were once again drawn to this area. Now, to put all of this in context, we do require a little social history at this point, because what happens in Quebec in the 1960s was quite extraordinary. The Quiet Revolution, as it has come to be known, was a series of sweeping socio-political and socio-cultural changes across the province that dramatically altered the cultural landscape. This included the secularization of the government, the introduction of a welfare state, refocusing on federalist ideals, the enormous investment in education, and lastly, as we are discussing today, huge infrastructure projects. The Quiet Revolution, which, by the way, is the most brilliantly Canadian name for a revolution that we could have ever imagined, it drove power from the church and large private companies back towards the Quebecois, the people of Quebec. Anyway, in 1967, with the revolution nearing its peak, Hydro-Quebec increased exploration work on the La Grande and East Main rivers by sending hundreds of people into the area via airplane to study the feasibility of constructing hydroelectric dams there. Champion-in-chief of the project was a politician by the name of Robert Bourassa, who in the late 1960s was considered a backbencher, but whose rise to power would come very quickly. Bourassa and the president of Hydro-Quebec, Roland Giraud, met in 1969 to discuss the project, and it became a key component during Bourassa's Liberal Party leadership contest and his victory in Quebec's general election in 1970. With the election all sewn up, Bourassa moved quickly, and in 1970 he traveled to New York to secure funding for the project. Incidentally, during a period known as the October Crisis in Quebec, when the Quebec Liberation Front kidnapped the provincial deputy premier, Pierre Laporte, and British diplomat James Cross, eventually killing Laporte. In response, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, a series of emergency measures designed to be used in the event of war or a major insurrection, which curtailed personal freedom and deployed the army onto the streets. It was only the third time such an act had ever been enacted in Canada, with the two previous occasions coming during the World Wars. In 1971, Bourassa unveiled the plans that would go on to become the James Bay Project, which included US engineering firm Bechtel overseeing the construction, which no doubt explains the trip to New York. The hydroelectric plans came with two different options. Either the dams would be placed on the Nottoway, Broadback, Rupert, and Harricana rivers in the south, or on rivers to the north, which included La Grande and East Main rivers. Both options were carefully studied, and in 1972 the northern option was chosen as it was deemed more cost-effective and would cause less harm to the forest areas surrounding it. The southern rivers were also believed to be too silty, which would have made the whole damming process considerably harder. If the scale and size of the James Bay Project were quite astonishing, then the build-up to it was certainly far from dull. Now, I know building a road doesn't necessarily get many excited, but how about building a road 700 kilometers long through some of the most difficult terrain on the planet? The James Bay Road is, in itself, a huge achievement, and it acted as the access road for the entire project, running from Matagami to Radisson, which was founded in 1975 to accommodate workers for the James Bay Project. The road is fully paved and well maintained even through the harsh Canadian winter, though you might want to plan carefully should you ever find yourself on it. It has only one service station and includes the longest stretch of road in Canada without a service stop, coming in at 381 kilometers, that's 236 miles. Once the road had been built, work could begin on the dams and the reservoirs. Now, remember how I remarked about the Quiet Revolution being a great Canadian name for social change? Well, between 1970 and 1974, things were far from quiet with these construction projects. But that wasn't down to accidents or weather or even the wild animals that tend to roam the area. No, this was down to inter-union rivalries. Yep, you heard that right. In the early years of the James Bay Project, there were no fewer than 540 incidents involving rival unions, some of which resulted in bloody fighting. At this point in Quebec, employment possibilities were fiercely contested, principally between two rival unions, one with a French name that I'm not going to try and pronounce, but the short version is FTQ, and the Confederation of National Trade Unions, the CNTU. This culminated in the barely believable events of the 21st of March 1974, when members of the FTQ union rioted on the building site of the new LG2 power station in response to one subcontractor refusing to fire two workers allied to the CNTU. And when I say rioted, they absolutely tore the place apart, using their bulldozers to destroy the building site, which was then set on fire, apparently just for good measure, because when a bulldozer doesn't do it, just light it on fire. The damage caused that day was believed to have totaled some $34 million. Initially, the government brought legal action against the unions, but this was later settled out of court for just 200,000 Canadian dollars, which seems a little fishy. Now, if that was strange, it does get even weirder. The investigation unearthed a catalogue of misdemeanors involving the powerful unions at the time and their links to the Montreal Mafia. The Cliche Commission, which investigated the riot and the role of the unions, reported tales of nepotism, bribery, sabotage, blackmail, and intimidation, charges of union organizers with criminal records who gave lessons in how to break legs, thugs for hire who would happily beat up a rival union organizer's teenager or strangle their dog. Now, eventually, all of this was straightened out, or maybe just conveniently brushed under the carpet, but another massive problem soon loomed. As I mentioned earlier, this particular part of Quebec is home to various groups of indigenous people, the largest of which was the Cree, numbering roughly 5,000, but there were also the Inuit further north, including another 3,500 people. Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely shocked to hear that the native people in this area were not consulted over the plans that vast amounts of their land would just be flooded. Anger quickly erupted as the Quebec government was accused of violating treaties that had guaranteed the protection of the Cree and Inuit lands, and Boy, is this all sounding rather familiar. The Cree fought back and hired lawyers to argue their case. At this point, a split between the main Canadian government and the Quebec government appeared, with the national government backing the Cree claims, while Bourassa's government fought an increasingly hopeless battle against them. At one point, it seemed that the case was destined for the Supreme Court, but a deal was eventually struck and the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement was signed in November 1974, which included limitations on further expansions, extended environmental protection, and a handy 225 million Canadian dollars to be used for education and development purposes within the Cree and Inuit communities. Okay, after all of that setup, we haven't even spoken about the actual construction yet. Phase 1 took roughly 14 years to complete and included large-scale water diversions of the East Main, Apponequet, and Kaniapiskau rivers to the newly formed dammed reservoirs on the La Grande River, which increased the average flow of the rivers from 1,700 to 3,300 cubic meters a second. That's a volume equal to half of the Goodyear blimp passing through the river every single second. 3 power stations were constructed during this phase: La Grande 2, now known as the Robert Bourassa, La Grande 3, and La Grande 4. LG2 was built between 1972 and 1981 and remains the largest power generating site in North America, with an installed capacity of 5,616 megawatts. And as the generating station is also underground, 137.2 meters to be exact, it is also the largest underground power station on the planet. The dam itself is located 6 kilometers upstream from the generating station and measures 162 meters in height and has a huge length of 2.8 kilometers. Phase 1 was rounded out with the construction of the LG3 and LG4 dams, along with 5 reservoirs, which amounted to a colossal area of 11,300 square kilometers, which is around the size of Wales. Everything about this project was just on a truly massive scale, with 155 million cubic meters of fill, 138,000 tons of steel, 550,000 tons of cement, and nearly 70,000 tons of explosives used during Phase 1 alone. A total of 215 dikes and smaller dams were constructed in the area, with one dike in particular reaching an extraordinary 56 stories. A vast network of transmission lines measuring 4,800 kilometers was installed to bring power to southern Quebec and also eventually to connect to the US power grid. Phase 1 was officially completed in 1984. The second phase of this quite staggering project got underway in 1989 and included the construction of 5 secondary power plants: La Grande 1, La Grande 2A, La Forge 1, La Forge 2, and Brissay, which added a further 5,200 megawatts of generating capacity. Phase 2 also included 3 new reservoirs amounting to a further 1,288 square kilometers, which is bigger than the whole city of Los Angeles. And that is a big city. Now let's just take one of these power stations, the La Grande 1. At just 25 meters, it's not exactly a giant, but it does stretch to 2.5 kilometers in length. Its dam volume is 1,070,000 cubic meters, which is enough to fill the Albert Hall in London 11.5 times. The power station has an installed capacity of 1,436 megawatts and includes 12 fixed-blade propeller-type turbines, 8 of which were made by General Electric, while the other 4 came from GEC Alstom. Now, if you thought the Cree and the Inuit were furious back in the 1970s, the proposals during Phase 2 of another extension, known as the Great Whale River Project, caused international consternation. The plans, that were sometimes referred to as James Bay 2, consisted of the Great Whale Complex and other dams on the Great Whale, Nottoway, and Rupert Rivers. But here's the real kicker. The electricity being produced by this third phase would not supply power to Quebec or even Canada, but the large, noisy neighbor to the south, the United States. A collection of states in the US Northeast had signed a contract with Hydro-Quebec to send electricity to the US, and this heavily contributed to the unpopularity of the project. By the early 1980s, the natural water flow around the area had been severely affected, while hunting grounds for the Cree had also been lost. While the initial efforts to halt the Great Whale River Project proved ineffective, once the information became public, it prompted a mutual backlash in both the US and Canada, and in 1992, the US states withdrew from the agreement. 2 years later, the project was scrapped altogether. We like to assume that any renewable energy source comes with a few environmental or social impacts, but as we've seen with the Three Gorges Dam, that's just not the case. Speaking of the monumental Chinese undertaking, if you feel particularly inspired about dams after this video and want to know more about the Three Gorges, well, we did an entire video on that many months ago. I think it was one of our first videos, actually. Perhaps the biggest environmental issue has been the release of mercury into the water. The James Bay project flooded vast areas of boreal forest, resulting in the natural release of mercury from the flooded vegetation, which could not be dispersed and diluted as it would normally be in natural situations. The exact effects are still a little murky, but what is certainly clear is that northern Quebec's Cree now have the highest measured methyl mercury concentration of all the Canadian First Nations, while mercury levels in flatfish have risen fourfold, while in some pike varieties that figure is closer to 7. Other environmental impacts include a severe alteration in water flow with massive increases in water runoff rates thought to have increased by 500%, affecting trees near the shoreline and generally resulting in the slow decaying of flora around the rivers. The social impact on the Cree and the Inuit has also been enormous. These were communities that had very little interaction with the outside world before the construction of the James Bay Road. As in the United States, the result of the interaction between native people and modern civilization has also not been pretty. Poverty, drug and alcohol abuse, sexual abuse, lack of clean water and adequate sanitation, poor housing, low standards of education. We could go on, but we'll stop there. These issues are not restricted to the Cree and the Inuit and are felt across Canada's First Nations, and it's clear that progress doesn't necessarily bring prosperity and health to all. The James Bay project was a vast and messy affair. The 8 power stations in the area now produce 83 terawatt-hours a year, which is enough to power the entirety of the country of Belgium. But it came with significant environmental and social impacts, as we have seen. As I said right at the start of today's video, this seems to be a mega project that hasn't received a great deal of attention. Maybe it's because of its remote location, maybe it's the questionable impact on the native people and the environment, or maybe it's just because it happened a few decades ago. But this was an enormous undertaking that has dramatically altered a vast area of our planet and the lives of thousands of people. If I was to hazard a guess, I'd say that perhaps the Canadian government doesn't necessarily want a great deal of attention placed on this area, but who knows? Maybe it's even the mysterious Canadian mafia. Probably not. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you've got a suggestion for a future Mega Projects video, you know what to do. Leave it below. And thank you for watching.